I would like to welcome you to this roundtable discussion, this panel discussion, dedicated to understanding the 2012 American presidential elections. My name is Csaba Nikolényi. I'm chair of the Department of Political Science. And indeed, the Department of Political Science, in cooperation with the Office of Advancement and Alumni Relations of Concordia University, are delighted to bring to you a distinguished line of speakers, professors, specialists in the subject matter of American politics and American electoral politics. We are fortunate to have with us today Professor Graham Dodds from the Department of Political Science, Professor Michael Lipson from the Department of Political Science, Professor Graham Carr, Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies, and in a few minutes, Professor Harold Chorney from the Department of Political Science will also be joining us. Unfortunately, you did not come here today to listen to me, so I'm going to keep it short. I will, in fact, only lay out the rules of the procedures for the next hour and a half. I'm going to ask our speakers in the order that I have just laid out to speak for no more than 10 minutes each and share with you their particular take on the themes that were advertised on the flyer. Professor Dodds is going to talk about the implications of the presidential election result for domestic politics. Dr. Lipson is going to discuss implications for US foreign policy. We asked Dr. Carr to discuss the implications of the elections for Canada and political culture, broadly conceived. And Dr. Chorney is going to discuss the implications of the results for the American economy. Without further ado, I turn the floor over to our first speaker, Dr. Graham Dodds.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Csaba, and thank you everybody for coming. It's good to be here. I think we've decided we'll just stay seated here to speak, but we'll see how it goes. There's a lot I could talk about here, obviously. I have both a personal and professional interest in the events of Tuesday. But I think I'll speak for just 5, maybe 8 minutes or so, outlining a few broad points, and I'd be happy to go into greater detail about any of these or not. We can talk about something else as you prefer. But just very quick, some quick thoughts, and I've sort of outlined them in terms of journalism, history, political science, sociology. I was going to do anthropology as well, but we'll leave that for later. So journalism. It's been my impression as I talk to journalists and consume media, watch a lot of CNN, et cetera, that there's been a lot of talk about the implications of Tuesday for near-term political events. It's hard to see a newscast or read a story that doesn't have the word fiscal cliff in the first paragraph. And that's important, and that's something everyone should know about if you don't. But I think there's perhaps too little appreciation for the magnitude of what happened Tuesday in the aggregate. In other words, sure, it'll be back to business as usual very soon with big pressing issues. But it's not every day the U.S. elects a black liberal as president. It happened 4 years ago, and it was big news. It's still big news. As Joe Biden would say, it's a big effing deal. It really is, and people should be aware of that and think about it. It's profound. I still can't believe it happened 4 years ago, let alone 2 days ago. I think Obama's allowed a victory lap or two before we start to talk about the fiscal cliff, is what I'm trying to say. History. I think that arguably this election is an exception to the fact that Americans, and full disclosure, I am one, tend to have no historical memory whatsoever. I mean, here in Quebec, God knows, people pepper their politics with history. We're still fighting the plains of Abraham. In the U.S., history is absolutely absent from politics. People say, oh, 9/11 was unprecedented. The U.S. homeland was never attacked. Never mind Japan and Pearl Harbor. Japan actually occupied part of Alaska. It attacked the west coast of the United States. There were German saboteurs on the east coast. The World Trade Center was attacked by Islamic terrorists 8 years before 9/11. Never happened, unprecedented. Americans have no historical memory. I think this election shows they do, or at least they can be pushed to have some historical context. In other words, I think a lot of people decided to give Obama a second shot because they remembered how bad things were 4 years ago. And that's actually asking a lot of the American voter. I think a lot of people said he was dealt a bad hand, maybe didn't play it all that well, but it certainly limited his success. So I would like to think that Americans have a newfound capacity for historical contextualization. I'd like to think a lot of things, and that's probably wishful thinking, but I'm seizing on that. Political science. I think that Tuesday's elections may arguably have implications not just for real-world politics, who cares about that, but for the academic study of politics. I'm being sarcastic, but I think there are implications for political science as a discipline. First, one of the old chestnuts of American poli-sci is that presidential debates don't matter. They never change anything. Yeah, well, funny thing about that, it seems that sometimes they do. The first of the 3 debates in Denver radically changed the dynamics of the race and made it a lot more close the last 30 days than it had been before then. So I think political scientists need to go back and rethink that little bit of received wisdom. Second, voter turnout. This was a very low voter turnout election. This has gone very little remarked, at least in what I've read so far. And the numbers are still trickling in. They're still counting votes in Florida, we were saying before. They're always counting votes in Florida. But the aggregate numbers are out there. And despite billions, that's billions, not millions, not tens of millions, not hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars being spent by both sides to identify voters and actually get them to the polls, the numbers were way down from 4 years ago. 4 years ago, Obama got 9 million more votes than he got Tuesday. That's incredible, I think. And on the Republican side, Romney got 2 million fewer votes than John McCain. There were tens of millions of Americans, frankly, who should have voted, but who did not. And this is, I think, very strange, again, given the remarkable historical amounts of money devoted towards getting more people to vote. Third, implications for quantitative analysis. One of the remarkable things in this campaign, I think, is Nate Silver becoming a celebrity. This guy who writes this great blog, 538 for the New York Times, read by millions of people. It's not even really a blog. It's an aggregator of polling data and an assessor thereof. It's just become incredibly popular. I mean, he's on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. I mean, parents are talking about him on the sidelines of kids' soccer games. It's the biggest thing out there. And I think this will lead to an even greater vogue for quantitative analysis in political science, because his nerdy number crunching was a lot more correct than the received wisdom of traditional politicos who thought they understood what was happening, and it turns out they just didn't. So I think this will lead again to his popularity and his prescience, his accuracy, will lead to an even greater push for the quantification of the study of political science. And sort of the last point I'll touch on here at the outset is sociology. So this idea of demographics as destiny. I was speaking with a colleague who thought it was remarkable as he watched John King's magic map and the data coming in, and, oh, Franklin County, that's rural, 47% Catholic, you have a 10% African-American population here, as if that determines your politics. And that's offensive, right? People are allowed to think differently than the majority of the groups that they belong to, but usually they don't. And in particular, on the Republican side, one thing they're chewing through right now is they just have to find a way to appeal more to women, to non-whites, and to people outside the South and the Great Plains, parts of the Rocky Mountain West. The gender gap in this last election was 18 points, which is nearly a record. Many couples with the guy voting for the Republicans and the woman voting for Obama. This is a huge part of political culture, and the gap was about as wide as it has ever been. And this other one I just came across, the percent of Romney voters who were white, 88%. The U.S. is an incredibly diverse place, becoming more so by the minute, and the Republican Party finds themselves a thin slice of the spectrum of the rainbow of diversity that is the United States. They're going to have to do something. We can go into much more detail about this, talk about other things, but I thought I would just start with that for now. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lisa?
So I think I'm on the program as speaking about implications of the election for foreign policy. I'm going to broaden that a bit and sort of talk about foreign policy and the election, and I'll start with implications of foreign policy for the election. So how did foreign policy affect the election? What role did it play in the campaigns? And it was not. It was by far not the leading issue in the either the campaigns or the election. And to the extent that it was generally seen as a plus for the Democrats and for Obama, which is unusual in recent historical memory. So I think that's often goes unremarked, but was worth noting. In exit polls, the percentage of people, there was one question in the exit polls was, here are 4 issues, which do you think was the most important in determining your vote? and the economy was overwhelmingly most important. Foreign policy was chosen by 5% of respondents in the exit polls. Those who said that foreign policy was their main issue and the main reason that they chose the candidate that they did went for Obama 56% to 33%. So where foreign policy came up in the campaign, in the debates, it was largely about the Obama administration's success in locating and killing Osama bin Laden, in keeping the promise to get the United States out of Iraq and to begin the process of withdrawing from Afghanistan, and the fact that there were no major crises on Obama's watch so far. And sort of the one real negative for Obama in terms of foreign policy was the controversy over the death of the American ambassador at the consulate in Benghazi, which I think that was used by the Romney campaign to rally its own supporters and partly to just have something to say about foreign policy, because Obama really did not leave a lot of room to attack him from the right on foreign policy. The criticisms that have been made of Obama's foreign policy in his first term have tended to be things like the extent to which drone strikes in Pakistan and elsewhere have killed civilians, the extent to which there's been continuity with some of the anti-terrorism policies of the Bush administration. So these are things that people on the left are more concerned about, but not things that Mitt Romney was going to criticize Obama about. And so Benghazi gave them an opening of something they could talk about from a more criticism from the right. But then in the second debate, the kind of live fact-checking of Romney's false claim that Obama had not called it terrorism immediately after the event hurt Romney at that point. And in the third debate, the debates focused on foreign policy. When the very first question was about Benghazi, Romney kind of pulled back and spoke vaguely and didn't use it to attack Obama given the opportunity. And so my sense is it may have kind of energized some of Romney's pre-existing supporters. I don't think it changed a lot of minds or made much of a difference in the end. Obama was widely seen as the decisive winner of the third debate. On the debate focused on foreign policy, it gave him an opportunity to sort of display his role as commander-in-chief, and Romney chose the tactic largely of saying, I agree with President Obama's positions, but I would talk about it differently or do it faster or something like that. So there wasn't a real substantive critique of Obama's foreign policy in that debate, and I think that helped Obama. So overall, this was mostly a domestic policy election. To the extent that foreign policy mattered, it largely helped the Obama administration or helped the Obama campaign and helped Obama's reelection. Moving to the implications of the election for foreign policy, and part of the reason I wanted to sort of put this second is, in a way, it's a sort of fairly short answer. Obama was reelected, same president, probably the same foreign policy, so you would expect continuity. So you could argue the implications are not that great, except that we have Obama in the White House rather than Romney, and things might have been different, significantly different with a President Romney. It's hard to tell because Romney was not at all clear during the campaign about what he would do in terms of foreign policy. And if you look at what he said during the primaries when he was running for the Republican nomination versus what he said in the general election when he moved to the center, he was kind of all over the map. He didn't draw a lot of substantive differences with Obama. There were a number of advisors to the Romney campaign drawn from different sort of strands of the Republican Party. So he had both neoconservatives who had been members of the Bush administration, but also more kind of traditional conservatives, more realist-oriented foreign policy figures in the Republican Party. And it was never really clear whether he was siding with one set of views or the other. From some reports, even the advisors who were writing memos to Romney about what foreign policy positions he should take were never really sure whether he was reading these memos or who he agreed with. And so it's not clear what what a Romney administration in a counterfactual world would have actually done, and therefore we don't really know to what extent would it have been different from the Obama administration in foreign policy. We do know that Romney and Ryan as a ticket had essentially zero foreign policy experience, and in recent history that's a fairly striking lack of foreign policy experience between both the presidential and vice presidential nominee. But beyond that, it's kind of hard to say what difference it would have made if they had been elected as opposed to Obama and Biden being reelected, because it's not very clear what Romney and Ryan would have done. So Obama is reelected. This means we should probably expect a large degree of continuity in U.S. foreign policy. And Obama, in his first term, adopted a very prudent and pragmatic approach to foreign policy in terms of the sort of standard way of framing these debates in U.S. foreign policy classes like the one I teach of the debate between realists and idealists. Obama is generally seen as siding more with the realist approach, not making sort of human rights and promotion of ideals a major priority, but instead focusing on protecting the national security and economic interests of the United States and avoiding being drawn into major conflicts or risky initiatives. One area where there will be some change in a second Obama term in foreign policy is in personnel. So we know that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will be stepping down, and Secretary of the Treasury Timothy Geithner will also be stepping down. And so one thing you'll start seeing a lot of speculation and debate in the press about in the next few days is who's going to replace them. And most of the reports on this mention the same kinds of shortlists, but no one really knows. John Kerry is seen as a leading candidate to replace Clinton as Secretary of State. Kerry was, he spoke at the Democratic Convention. He played Romney in Obama's debate preparation. He was, of course, the unsuccessful Democratic candidate in 2004, and he also, as the Democratic nominee in 2004, chose Barack Obama to give the keynote speech at the Democratic Convention, which basically launched Obama's national political career. But on the other hand, Kerry holds a Senate seat in Massachusetts, and were he to step down to become Secretary of State, that would then lead to a special election in Massachusetts. The Democrats just won a campaign for the Senate seat in Massachusetts, the other Senate seat in Massachusetts, defeating Scott Brown, and I'm not sure they want to give him another opening. There's also, we're talking mostly about the presidential election, but there were, of course, congressional elections as well on Tuesday. And so that's led to some turnover in terms of members of the House of Representatives and the Senate on the committees dealing with foreign policy. So some of the leading figures in Congress with foreign policy responsibilities are changing. Senator Joe Lieberman, who is an independent caucusing with the Democrats but often sympathetic to the Republicans' approach to foreign policy, is not going to be there anymore. Senator James Webb from Virginia, who's a former Secretary of the Navy, as well chose not to run for re-election. So that may change some of the internal dynamics in Congress. And it is possible that because Obama will not be running for re-election again and doesn't have to think when he's deciding policies in the second term about how that would, what implications that would have for a future re-election run, that may give him some more freedom of action in terms of how he deals with, say, Netanyahu in Israel, or some of the other issues he'll face. There's also a tendency that presidents in the last couple of years of a second term, when they cannot run for re-election again and therefore are what's known in U.S. politics as a lame duck, will sometimes find their influence with Congress and domestic affairs waning and may turn to foreign policy as an area where they can more easily wield presidential authority without the need for congressional votes and legislation. So we may see more of a shift to foreign policy focus in the last 2 years of Obama's second term.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Chaba. So I'm going to touch on two things: the implications of the election for Canada, and I guess more generally the implications of the elections for political culture. In terms of the Canadian context, true to form, Canada did not loom large in the American debate around election 2012, with a couple of exceptions. In the most notable was the specific policy around the Keystone XL pipeline and access to Nebraska, which was an issue that Mitt Romney raised very publicly in one of the televised debates, indicating that he would overturn the moratorium that the Obama administration had placed on the pipeline project. Obviously, Governor Romney didn't win the election, so the future of the moratorium remains open to question, and it's a fraught discussion topic in Canada and the United States, whether the pipeline itself should go ahead. The other specific Canadian policy issue that came up, not in the national election, but in the Michigan elections, had to do with a ballot initiative to stop a proposal to build a new bridge from Windsor to Detroit across the Detroit River, a bridge proposal that would be fully funded by the government of Canada, would want to point out. And the owner of the existing Ambassador Bridge in linking the two cities had attempted to bring that project to a halt through a ballot initiative, but the ballot initiative failed. So those were probably the two most visible policy examples of Canada registering in the political discourse around election 2012. Now, I guess we could say that lack of attention could be construed as a good thing for Canadians, but I think it's revealing on a number of fronts. One is, and Michael was just talking about foreign policy, and I'm sure when Harold arrives, he'll be talking about trade in the U.S. economy. And when American politicians talk about trade and foreign policy, Canada might as well not exist. It's simply a given that Canada is there, regardless of the reality that Canada continues to be the largest single trading partner of the United States, and a sovereign country, and therefore a country with whom the U.S. engages in foreign relations. The discussion of foreign relations was a discussion essentially around the Middle East and China, period, point final. And so the Canadian context doesn't figure very much in that regard. I think from the Canadian perspective, the outcome, probably one of the most important questions looming as a result of the election, a question that is unresolved at this moment, has to do with the financial and economic future of the United States. Not simply in terms of the fiscal cliff. Everybody's saying the right things about the fiscal cliff at the moment, but the reality is that there are two different entities that want to drive the truck that is hurtling toward the edge of the cliff. The Republicans in the House and the Democrats in the Senate and in the White House. And obviously, Canada's financial fortunes, economic fortunes, are inextricably tied to the economy of the United States. And I think for Canadians, in some respects, looking back at the kind of perilous game of chicken that has entered into American fiscal politics in the last few years, should be yet another reason for governments, industry, public policy makers in Canada to be thinking about the future of the Canadian economy in relationship to a changing global economy. And I found it very interesting and wanted to read all sorts of symbolism into the reality that Prime Minister Harper was in fact on a trade mission to India at the time when the U.S. elections were taking place. Canada is in a hugely dependent financial situation vis-a-vis the United States, even while juggernaut economies, whether it's China, Brazil, India, and other parts of the world, are growing and emerging. And I think one of the important questions for Canadian policymakers, not just linked to this election or this election result, has to do with the nature of Canada's future relationship, economic relationship with the United States, and more importantly, its relationship with other potential trade and innovation partners globally. Because I think there is a vulnerability in overdependence, and a vulnerability in overdependence on an economy such as the American economy, which has so many points of weakness embedded within it. In terms of the wider implications for political culture, and I think this is really picking up on Graham Dodds's points about the nature of the campaign and political journalism. We know that political parties in Canada watch very closely what goes on in the U.S. and that some parties have, well, probably all parties to some degree, have imported tactics and strategies from American electoral politics in the past. I think it's going to be really difficult to read the tea leaves on what worked and what didn't work in this particular election campaign. There are a number of huge questions that the campaign has inadvertently, I think, posed, one of which is the engagement piece. You know, the massive disengagement of the American public and large cohorts of the American public with the electoral process. A disengagement challenge which has existed in Canada in recent years too. Again, watching the tactics of American politics, the heavy investment in negative television ads, the theatrical political campaigns, the highly theatrical staged political events, you have to, I think, start to scrutinize and ask the question what the political payoff is when at the end of the day the only significant movement in terms of popular vote or public participation was that fewer and fewer people, millions and millions of people, were less motivated to participate in electoral politics than they had been 4 years before. Rolled into that, I think, is a series of, for the moment, unanswerable questions about the role of new forms of communication, social media in particular. You know, we recall that in the 2008 election campaign, the Obama team used social media very successfully to mobilize younger Americans and get them out to vote. But the impact of social media in this American electoral campaign is far from clear-cut. We know from experiences elsewhere in the world that social media can be a powerful mobilizing factor, particularly an event-specific mobilizing factor. But as a campaign phenomenon, as a campaign tool, I don't think it's entirely clear what conclusions could be drawn from this election. I think one of the other things, and I'll stop with, well, two other points. Part of the engagement piece has to do with the polarizing nature of American political discourse at the moment. This is not simply a product of the 2012 campaign. It's something which tactically has been building for many, many years. But that polarization of the electorate, according to demographic cohorts, has, I think, contributed to a further polarized electorate in terms of engagement with politics and in terms of party choice. What's the message for Canadian politics or Quebec politics from those tactics of polarization? Does it work? Does it work for short-term ends, but in fact embeds very long-term disadvantages, which seems to be the case with respect to the Republican strategy? And the last thing that I would just throw out there is one of the striking things about this election campaign was the enormous number of Americans who voted in advance polls, who just frankly didn't want to listen to what the politicians were saying all the way through the campaign, who felt they had to do their civic duty and got it out of the way for whatever reason as soon as possible and then waited for the outcome. And I think that advanced polling phenomenon is another intriguing element in terms of what it may say about changing political culture in the United States.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are opening the floor for questions. I'm going to ask those of you who are about to ask a question to please walk to the microphone. There's a microphone right across from me, behind the table on the left-hand side. And please ask one question at a time. There is plenty of time for everyone to raise multiple questions. We have enough time left, but please, one question at a time. There's a microphone right over there.
The Electoral College, I think it's a unique institution in any country in the world. Is it worthwhile to eliminate the Electoral College? Is there any interest in changing the Electoral College? Any panelists, what do you personally think about the Electoral College?
Would you like any of the presenters in particular to answer your question, or it's open?
Sure.
Yeah, Dr. Dutz.
Yeah, the Electoral College. So, when I teach this in my classes, I tell the students, we're going to go through this carefully, and it's not going to make any sense. And that doesn't mean you don't understand it. It means you do understand it because it doesn't make any sense. It's a crazy system, is what I'm trying to say. It's not a fair system because it gives small, frankly, rural conservative states a disproportionate say. It's not fair. But it's in the Constitution. And in the U.S. Constitution, it's almost impossible to amend. And frankly, there are enough small states that get a disproportionate say out of the current system that they would be strongly inclined to try to block a constitutional amendment. And more broadly, in comparative politics, countries don't change their electoral systems without an electoral train wreck making them do so. If 2000 wasn't a train wreck, I don't know what a train wreck would be, and that wasn't enough. So it's a crazy system, it's not fair, but everybody's stuck with it. C'est la vie. Sorry, it's not a very hopeful answer, but that's how I see it, at least.
Yeah, if you were to design a democracy for the 21st century, I don't think you'd have an electoral college. I think there are a lot of features of American politics that you wouldn't incorporate into an ideal design of a political system or an electoral system for the 21st century. Frankly, the same is true with the parliamentary system. Neither system is perfect, and historically, both systems have been subject to manipulation and elasticity and pressures from whichever political forces have been in a position to bring about change, even minor change. A minor change incrementally can have significant results. So,
Dr. Lipson, do you want to address the question?
I broadly agree with the previous comments. Because it's so difficult to amend the Constitution, and there's very little real prospect of that, people who would like to reform or eliminate the Electoral College are looking for sort of ways around it, leaving it in place in the Constitution, but trying to get states to agree that they will cast their electoral votes for whichever candidate wins the national popular vote. So ways that you could basically replace a national popular vote, replace the Electoral College vote with the national popular vote in practice without having to go all the way through the constitutional amendment process. But I think the prospects of that working in the near term are relatively low.
So let's take the next question, and after this question is answered, we'll take a break from the questions and we'll turn to Professor Chorny, who will tell us about the implications of the results for the American and perhaps also the regional and the global economy. Yeah. Sir.
Yeah, I just can't figure out how a guy that wants to kill Sesame Street and kill the Pell Grants, how could he get the vote of the youth? The youth vote went up from what, the pundits have given you all slice and dice everything you want. The religions, the ethnics, the city, the color of the skin, and they all, and the worldview. There's only one country that didn't want Obama to win. I think there's two, but one is Israel, of course. And so there's a very, very tough situation now with that. But the youth vote went up, and how could you have two white guys getting the the Latino vote? He got 25%. Never win with that. And of course, that's the fastest growing part of the population. And Romney was saying to, my father's born in Mexico. Big deal. I mean, I'm serious. This is ridiculous. I mean, he was just just fumbling with everything. And what if instead of spending $3 billion on this campaign, they would only spend $1 billion? Would the result have been any difference? That's really my question, because there's so much crap in there.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dodds?
Let's start with Big Bird. I'm working on a paper for a conference I'm going to next week on sort of recurring memes in the culture wars. Big Bird is one of those. I don't know if everybody got this, but for attentive political junkies like myself, this is right out of 1996 when Bill Clinton was running for re-election. Newt Gingrich and Republicans were threatening to cut government, and part of that was cut federal funding for PBS, which brings us Sesame Street and therefore Big Bird. And John Glenn, the American astronaut and then senator from Ohio, gave a speech in which he said, who's going to vote for these guys? They want to cut Big Bird for 5-year-olds, school lunch programs for 10-year-olds, summer jobs for 15-year-olds, and student loans for 20-year-olds. And Bill Clinton thought that was the best line, and he kept using it. Well, Romney was kind of doing a wink and nod, saying, yeah, we're going back to that old debate, and I want to get rid of Big Bird, even though I love him, and he professed love for Jim Lehrer of PBS as well. I mean, for a lot of Canadians, I think they look at this and they're puzzled by why a Republican candidate, a moderately conservative one like Romney, could have such broad appeal. And I guess there are two answers. The U.S. is just a more conservative place. I mean, this is not a surprise. We can argue about why it is, but it is. It's just a much more profoundly conservative country than Canada, and especially than Quebec. Secondly, look, it's a two-party system. And I don't think it has ever been wider than 60-40 one way or the other. So no matter how extreme, how unappealing a candidate is, he starts at a floor of 40%, and you go from there. So you add a bad economy, people not comfortable with Obama for perhaps racist or demographic reasons, and all of a sudden you're a plausible candidate.
Start at 47%, remember?
Well, there you go. I'll leave it at that. Well said.
Dr. Carr, Lipson? No? Okay, then let me turn the floor to Dr. Chorny. Dr. Chorny, you have 10 minutes, and then more questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I just came from teaching a class, hence that's why I've arrived late. Well, yes, he could. He won. Which comes as a delight to those of us, and there are a few of us in the room, more than a few, I suspect, who are very delighted by the fact that Barack Obama has won a second term, even though he has his faults. He's far from perfect, from my liberal instincts, but he's excellent despite that. And if you were up at 2 a.m. and saw the speech that he gave, which was an extremely powerful, rousing speech, rhetorically speaking, but also content-wise. It had a lot of content that was very important about the power of American democracy, the way in which democracy works, the necessity to dare to struggle, dare to win, an old slogan from the 60s, which I think is essentially what Obama practices, at great personal risk to himself, and at great personal sacrifice. But now he's in a position where, as George Bush famously said after winning an even smaller mandate against John Kerry, I have some political capital now and I intend to spend it. And so any time that he does things that the Republicans don't like, he should remind them of what Bush said and acted upon. However, there's a side to President Obama that's also quite conservative fiscally, and that's the whole fiscal cliff disaster that is embedded in this deal they made, a very bad deal, in my view, which says that unless they come to major agreements on how to restructure quote-unquote entitlements, a very ideologically loaded term, Actually, you're talking about people's benefits that they've worked for, paid taxes for, believed in for most of their lives. And in addition to health care for the elderly and for the poor. So, though they claim that that's not going to be touched, but once you start cutting to appease Republican political interests, you're going to get into trouble very swiftly, particularly if Boehner means what he says, and I think he does, that they think they have a mandate to prevent tax increases from occurring. So it's going to be an interesting struggle. I think we'll have to see how this works itself out. Clearly, if you the American economy is $15 trillion. If you cut out $1.3 trillion in cuts, as such as is contained in the fiscal cliff, that will slow the economy down and probably, it's not a certainty, but probably tip it into recession again if they actually don't work out a compromise. So the pressure on them, a self-imposed pressure that I think was inadvisable on the part of Obama having done in the first term, but they did it. This is a real serious potential problem in terms of how it gets worked out. You know, the entitlements, so-called, I hate using the word, we have to come up with a different word, people's benefits, the social democratic minimum, if you like, of American society. Ira Katznelson coined that very excellent term a number of years ago, also a Chicagoan, by the way. And the social democratic minimum benefits that people expect in American society, that they work very hard for, that they look forward to, if these get cut substantially, then a lot of the base of the Democratic Party, people who I know, are going to be extremely disappointed and very annoyed. So in the long run, politically, it's, to my view, not a good idea. So if one asks me, what are the differences for having elected Obama versus Romney, clearly the fiscal cliff meant that Romney would have definitely slashed a great deal of money out of social benefits, the social democratic minimum. Obama would have slashed less, and we're going to see how much he really does touch, and if he's not able to push through his tax increase. Graham could probably inform me better as to whether he has an option through presidential authority to somehow raise the tax levels. I don't think he does. I think he doesn't have that option. So he's going to be faced with a big dilemma, because I don't see the Republicans as saying, because they're fairly strong believers in what they've been arguing, and they're also very much inflamed by the Tea Party, or I call them teabaggers, on the young people know what I mean, on the right. These Republicans are not about to compromise, though some of them made nice statements that suggest they're open to compromise. So this is the first really big issue. The fiscal cliff is a very important issue. On the issue of recovery, I'm actually quite optimistic. If you look at a business cycle, which is what we're going through, even after a deep shock like the shock that occurred in 2008, when incidentally most of the deficit spending occurs, right, to get the deficit to 10%. It's in response to the worst collapse in the American economy since the Great Depression. And I've crunched the numbers and looked at 8 other recessions. This recession has the slowest recovery, not because, as Romney was suggesting, that they were misdirected policies. No, far from it. It's because the deficit that was introduced as a stimulus package was too small, and in fact was accompanied by cuts at the state and local level that countermanded the impact fiscally of the larger stimulus bill. So, but nevertheless, we're now 4.5 years into this business cycle downturn. We already see signs of gradual healing in terms of the unemployment rate very slowly dropping, as it always does after a deep recession. And we see job creation picking up, and we know that the corporations are loaded with cash. They admit it. The corporations and the banks have huge amounts of money. They're sitting on the money, right? Perhaps they sat on it for political reasons, but as a good Keynesian, I prefer to think, though I may be wrong, that they sat on it because they felt too uncertain about their rate of return if they were to invest it. but I see people shaking their heads, so maybe the political explanation is more powerful. It's certainly part of the picture, part of the formula. But now that opportunity, notwithstanding Rush Limbaugh and notwithstanding people who are, devout Republicans, that option is closed to them. They can't hang around for another 4 more years with the cash. So they're going to have to do something with it. And I think they're going to start spending it, and we're going to see more investment coming out. And I've already seen some statements from some of the big Wall Street actors suggesting, I mean, I read the Wall Street Journal religiously. It's very important to read it. Suggesting that they're about to start spending money as long as they're extended some sort of olive branch by the president, which he's already done, right? He's already suggested he's going to have talks with Romney. Maybe he'll appoint him ambassador to business or something like that, which wouldn't be a bad idea, actually. So I think that the business cycle is going to turn in a favorable direction. The Europeans are still in a big mess. The unemployment rate in Greece yesterday went up to 25%. And the European Central Bank is still extremely reluctant to do what the Fed is doing, which is buying up government debt to keep the interest rates very low. So we have this dilemma that exists. And let me say one other very important thing about the notion of entitlements and cutbacks and the fiscal fix that supposedly America and other societies need. You'll notice one of the biggest cheerleaders for this is our own Prime Minister Stephen Harper and our Finance Minister Flaherty, saying they hope now the Americans will address the fiscal problem. Why do they say that? Because they themselves are ideologically fiscal reactionaries, fiscal deep conservatives. You can't really measure the amount to which you have a structural deficit unless you in advance announce what you accept as the rate of full employment, right? And I'm getting the hook here, but I'm going to talk for a minute and a half since I was a bit late. The point is, the real rate of unemployment should be pushed down to what it was in the heady days of Bill Clinton, right? And to some extent, George Bush at the very beginning, which is under 4%. And once you do that, then calculate the flow of expenditures and the flow of revenues to see whether you actually do have a structural deficit. And I think if you do that, you're going to discover that you don't. You're going to be very close to budget balance. And the issue then becomes the demographic issue of where you will lie as healthcare costs go up. But healthcare costs may not go up as much as they expect because we now have in the United States a better, much more efficient healthcare system, which ought to bring about economies, which will cost you less per capita on healthcare than what has been experienced to date. The United States spends way more on its healthcare than other societies for arguably worse results, all right? If you're rich, high-tech medicine is available to you, and that's one of its benefits. But for the large numbers of people who are not wealthy and can't buy the first-class Cadillac healthcare, they get worse results, and that's clear in their data. So I see a number of ways in which the Republican argument is being partly absorbed by the Democrats because of the very hotly contested politics in the United States, and because I think the first group of economists advising Obama, Austin Goolsbee in particular, didn't understand, and I read his stuff, didn't understand what the deficit argument is about. There are many, many methodological differences about how to define deficits and debt. And I can give you 10 different measures of it with 10 different methodologies. So first of all, you have to decide what you're talking about, what's the right number, what's the rate of unemployment you're projecting it at, how long into the future it will go, so on and so forth. Well, I'll stop there.
I'm an American too. I was born in Canada, but I've been an American citizen all my life. I just want to say you mentioned one news cable network, CNN, which I'm somewhat interested in because my daughter was the correspondent for CNN. I might say in that time she was somewhat liberal, although 2 days ago she voted for Romney. My question to you is, do you feel and think that the media was biased in such a way, with the exception of Fox, that they had some influence on the people's voting
No. This is an old bugaboo that's been around, I mean, most famously since Nixon, or his vice president at the time, Agnew, the liberal media. And there were, I mean, it's a recurring theme in American politics. People say the media is biased. I mean, from a sort of social science perspective, the studies of this tend to perceive little, if any, bias. And increasingly, to the extent there is bias, it's neutralized out by bias elsewhere. So sure, there's MSNBC, which is avowedly liberal, but then there's Fox on the other side. And I just don't think that any of the big media outlets have enough power that even if they wanted to be biased, which I don't think they are, that they could do much. So for a variety of reasons, I personally don't see much in that charge. And I mean, the problem isn't so much bias within any one media outlet or systematically, certainly. It's, I think, the fracturing of news media where most people consume their news from one particular media outlet and are not exposed to other outlets. There are very few people like Dr. Shorty who will read the other side, as it were. And I mean, the Wall Street Journal is great. Its editorial stuff is a little different from the news reporting, but if you understand how capitalism works, you have to read the darn thing. You might not agree with their endorsements and pronouncements, but so no, I'm not very sympathetic on that. I mean, I don't know what your daughter's perspective would be as to whether she perceived CNN to be a hotbed of liberals covertly spinning the news to help the Democratic Party. I suspect not, but
MSNBC might.
Perhaps, but. And it's so different in Canada, right? I mean, my conservative friends swear the CBC is in bed with the Liberals, and I just, come on, I don't see it. But, Fox News is something else, and very few Canadians have really seen it because until recently you could not get it here. But when you go to the U.S., it is on every TV in every airport, hotel, restroom, bar, every place there's a TV in public, it's out there, and it's something else.
So maybe there's another part to that discussion, though, that isn't so much about the bias and whether the press shapes voter habits. But I think it's fair to say that the press has had a profound effect on political discourse in the United States, just in terms of the selection, the range of topics, the depth or absence of depth of coverage, and certainly the tone of journalism, particularly in the high-profile media outlets like Fox News. So it may not be a direct influence in terms of bias. People watch this anchor person and therefore vote one way or another. But I think there really has been a profound impact over time on the discourse as a whole, and that itself has created a whole other series of biases and has contributed to that phenomenon of polarization of the electorate that we were talking about before. So in a way, it's probably made people more comfortable with their own biases and identify more strongly with their own biases, which is a different kind of question from what you were asking, but I think it's a reality factor in politics in the U.S.
So I agree with Graham that I don't think that what's sometimes called the mainstream media in the U.S. has a partisan bias one way or the other. There are some studies that have attempted to measure this in this current election cycle just concluded and found that a higher proportion of stories about Obama were negative this time than last time, which has to do with the situation of the economy and so on. But what you get is Fox News is clearly biased, openly so, in favor of the Republicans. MSNBC is sort of the equivalent for the liberal and Democratic side, and that's new. There were a few election cycles where you had Fox News on the right and no counterpart on the left. I think 2008 was sort of the first one where MSNBC had taken an openly kind of partisan, well, not so much partisan, but a more political stance. And so now you have a bit more balance there, although Fox's viewership is much higher. But I think where the press does have, I'm not sure if biases are the right words, but kind of the way that it shapes the news. There are some tendencies that aren't necessarily partisan, but it's been there's long been criticism of media coverage of political campaigns for focusing on horse race issues, basically for who's ahead in the polls and who's got momentum and so on, rather than on the substance of the positions and policies being debated. I think that continued in the coverage of the 2012 election. There's also a sort of he said, she said tendency of just reporting what the candidates say without providing any evaluation of the factuality, or in Stephen Colbert's famous phrase, the truthiness of these statements. And there's been some attempt to address that with what's known as fact-checking. So after each debate, the cable networks will then go through and say, you know, this candidate said this, was it true or not, and come up with some kind of verdict. That doesn't seem to work. And so one of the striking things about the Romney campaign in particular, and so I'm going to be criticizing Romney, so I'll put my sort of biases out in the open. I'm an American citizen. I'm a registered Democrat. I voted for Obama. But I nonetheless think, and many of the commentators on this election have stated that the Romney campaign was exceptional in the dishonesty of the arguments that it made. And kind of the brazenness with which it made openly false statements. So the very first ad that Romney ran in the general election was a quote of Obama saying, if we talk about the election, we will lose. And this was actually taken out of context. It was Obama in 2008 quoting a McCain campaign aide who had said, if we, the McCain campaign, talk about the election, we will lose. And so the Romney campaign knowingly took that statement completely out of context and distorted it to make it seem like Obama was saying something completely different. It was absolutely obvious that this was a distortion, and they had to know they were going to be called on it, and they just didn't care. We can get away with it. Romney's pollster famously said in response to another criticism that we are not going to let our campaign be dictated by fact checkers. And the very last ad that Romney ran that got a lot of attention was a misleading ad that was meant to imply that the auto bailouts that had helped Obama in the Midwestern states was responsible for Chrysler, which built Jeeps, moving production of Jeeps from Ohio to China. This is false, and it was pointed out by the media that this was false. Some people think that the Romney campaign may have paid an electoral price for that in Ohio because for that ad, and this was sort of unusual, the major media outlets, including the leading Ohio newspapers, actually did run headlines saying Romney ad is misleading, that he's lying to you. But that's the exception. Most of the time, these blatantly false statements didn't really get, they didn't seem to cost the campaign. And so there was a lot of speculation that if Romney won, that would mean that future campaigns would feel completely free to just openly lie and expect that they wouldn't pay any price for making false claims. I think the fact that he did as well as he did might yield the same result. And so one dilemma that the media faces in covering campaigns is how do you attempt to fact check the candidates, and if so, can you do it more effectively than in 2012? And I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that yet.
Dr. Chorny, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I tend to agree with what Michael's been saying. I watched during the campaign regularly CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. I mean, obviously Fox is outrageous, but so too is MSNBC from the other perspective. They both are highly partisan. Fox tends to lie through their best liars like O'Reilly and Hannity and some of these other characters. MSNBC tends to be very deeply provocative, using Maddow and several of the others, who Chris Matthews and so on, and they bring Bill Maher on for extra salt in the wounds. So both of them indulge in, histrionic stuff. Though from an entertainment point of view, it's fascinating to see Donald Trump disintegrate on the Twitter sphere, and Karl Rove have a nervous breakdown on Fox. Both of which were available to millions of viewers during the election. But basically, the media reflect, the nature of American society and the nature of our own society, for that matter. Whatever the powerful wish to see discussed generally gets discussed. Whatever those without power would like to see discussed, they have to resort to social media, mostly, or find a way to, as Obama did, but with great compromises involved, to get accepted as a legitimate spokesperson in the mainstream media. I mean, I've had this problem for many, 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 many years, that I've been trying to explain deficit public finance to people. But 30 years, more than 30 years ago, I mentioned it to the CBC people. They've yet to allow a proper discussion of it, even with someone on the opposite side, because they think it's boring, right? But it's actually essential in a democracy to understand public finance, taxation, deficits and debt, and so on. So the media plays the kind of role that I think has been described by the others, and I agree that it's become coarser over time. Ever since gotcha journalism resulted in Watergate, where the media, and I'm married to a journalist, by the way, so I know the media kind of intimately. And the journalistic profession is very much interested in the headline story. That's what they want. And how they get it is of less importance to them, really. And that's where the problem lies. You need an educated body politic, the kind of body politic that Obama was describing, where citizens actively go out, they study the material, and they want to study it. Millions of people are actually interested in government, in cycles. They don't want to allow some elite to tell them what's right. They want to make up their own minds. So it's the function of the university, in my opinion, and the colleges, and our school system, to teach people as much as possible, both sides, of course. That's why I read the Wall Street Journal. I want to hear what they're saying, right? You need both sides to the argument, well presented in a passionate way by people like my colleagues, and then we'll get somewhere with a more educated body politic. Over time, it takes a long time, but over time we'll get somewhere, and the media will be forced to react to it. The media is reactive. It's not generally agenda setting, although Rupert Murdoch and even Conrad Black, he once famously answered, "Of course I want to write the editorials. That's why I bought the paper," right?
Thank you very much. Now, this is a roundtable dedicated to understanding the 2012 elections, and we've talked a lot about the implications, but probably not as much about the why, how to make sense of what actually happened, why did it happen. So to give more time our audience to come up to the microphone, I would like to ask each and every one of our presenters to tell us, why do you think we got the outcome that we did? We heard from Dr. Lipson that it wasn't really about foreign policy issues. So what was it? Was it the economy? Was it some last-minute change? Was it a question of money, race? What was it? Or purely electoral geography? In any order that you would like to take. Dr. Lipson.
So one of the striking things about this election was how closely a series of websites, Graham mentioned the 538.com blog, there are a number of such websites that do poll aggregation. So they take the polls and they average them in some way, and in some cases do weightings of which polls have been more accurate in the past, or complicated regression formulas for trying to measure kind of trends. And so there are, I think, 5 or 6 prominent such sites. And then a number of quantitatively oriented political scientists who have been working for, I think, decades now, trying to develop models in which they try to predict election outcomes based on a handful of variables, often 2 or 3 variables, such as presidential approval rating, whether the president is an incumbent or not, and some economic variables such as income growth in the second or third quarter of the election year. And in general, both these models and the polling aggregator sites did very well in predicting the outcome of this election. And so I think the first thing that tells us is that a lot of this is based on what what these election models refer to as the fundamentals, the sort of, rather than the skill or the particular messages that the campaigns pick or the day-to-day stories that are in the headlines during the campaign. The main determinants of election outcomes seem to be state of the economy, approval rating of the president, and a couple of other things. And based on that, there were predictions that came very close to the actual outcome that were made back in about June. So one debate within political science is, do campaigns matter at all? Or could you have just sort of determined what was going to happen based on these fundamentals in June and not spent $6 billion on campaign ads and so on? So I think the sort of basic finding of the more persuasive of these election models is incumbent presidents with growing economies are almost always reelected. And the U.S. economy now is not growing strongly, but it is growing. It's not in recession. And so the odds were that Obama was going to be narrowly reelected, and he was. And a secondary factor that I am not sure has gotten as much attention as it merits is just how sophisticated the Obama campaign's ground game, the ground game being the kind of turnout operation for identifying voters, figuring out which voters are going to support you, and then making sure that they get to the polls. And people who look at this have concluded that the Democrats this year, and particularly the Obama operation, made just huge advances over the state of the art in this area. Having to do with their ability to, at a very sophisticated way, figure out what kinds of messages work with which kinds of voters, and then target them very efficiently. Some of this is actually, this is kind of heartwarming for a social scientist, but some of this is based on controlled experiments in which they tested different messages on groups of voters who were selected to be more or less equivalent, and then were able to deploy that in the campaign. And so the major debate in terms of people trying to predict the outcome has been, was the electorate this year going to look more like 2004, which would work to Romney's advantage, or more like 2008, which would work to Obama's advantage? The Republicans were convinced that it was going to be more like 2004. The Democrats more like 2008. It turned out it was the latter. And that seems to have been at least partly driven by the greater ability of the Obama campaign to do just the mundane work of organizing on the ground, setting up field offices, figuring out which voters in which key districts and counties are more susceptible to your message, and then making sure that you actually persuaded them and got them to the polls.
Thank you. Dr. Carter?
Okay, well, my observations are going to be a lot less sophisticated than Michael's. I mean, I think at a certain level, the question is what's really at play in an election. What's really, and that's why the ground game, the real insider politics matters so much, because you have two fixed cohorts of the population who have decided, perhaps ancestrally, that they're Republican or Democrat. You have a group of so-called independents whom everyone is courting, and then you have that very other large cohort, highly differentiated cohort of people who aren't engaged in electoral politics at all. And so to move the game at all, you have to be able to win in one of those latter two categories. And I think further complicating the challenge is, again, the reality of the American system. And this gets back to the Electoral college system, the winner-take-all system, where in some states the campaign is irrelevant. The outcome of the campaign is foreordained. You know, I was struck the other night, and I'm sure everyone, the polls close at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and in some cases, states are declared in a nanosecond after the polls have closed, including large states like California, because the process of the campaign is simply irrelevant to the outcome. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all because there isn't really very much in play. I guess the part of Csaba's question, though, was about the campaign itself, and I can't help but wonder, what might have been. There was one surprise moment in the campaign, and that was Obama's missing in action routine for the first debate. And of course, impossible to imagine what would have happened if he'd actually been present at the debate, although it was a challenge because he was debating a chameleon, and that wasn't easy. But the outcome of that debate was that the press fixated on two things: that Obama had underperformed, and that Romney, regardless of what he said, had somehow established himself as a credible candidate. There was no discussion about the substance of the debate, what was said. It was simply about the performative nature of the debate, the presentation politics of the debate. And that that then became, that kind of injected life into a campaign, into an electoral campaign, a presidential electoral campaign, that until that moment didn't seem to be nearly as close as it turned out to be.
Thank you. Dr. Chorny?
Yes, thank you. Look, if you run on a platform, 2 percentage points is not a lot of difference. It's not even a couple of million votes. But if you run on a platform that's got people on it that are saying things about half the population, women, that are deeply offensive to many women, you're not in a good position to win an election, in my view. You've shot yourself in both feet simultaneously. And that's what was going on. There were these characters on the Republican side who got defeated, mind you. Several of them were defeated, who were saying things about abortion, about women's right to choose, that were deeply, deeply insulting and offensive to many millions of women. So I think the first thing to say is that's one of the reasons why Obama won. He had a policy that half the population was a little more sympathetic to than to the other side. So that's one thing. Secondly, the Hispanic vote, which has been talked about a lot, and I think it's pretty clear. If you have a policy that says you should self-deport people who are undocumented, illegally arrivees in the United States, where there's something like 10 million, 8 to 10 million of these people, they have relatives and friends, right, who are citizens and who are going to be deeply offended, and were deeply offended by that. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Romney got the lowest percentage of the Hispanic vote over at least 20 years. He was down to 27%, whereas even George Bush got 41%, right?
Hispanic participation was higher than
Yeah, there was a big turnout, and they voted disproportionately for Obama. So that was actually another big problem. Then you have, in addition to this, an iconic figure. Whatever else you might think of Barack Obama, he is an iconic person. He is the first black president of the United States of America. In addition, he speaks rather beautifully from the point of view of rhetoric. Like him or not, you can't help but be affected by him. So the inbuilt advantage of incumbency, plus this absolutely brilliant speaker, very intelligent politician, and a person that many, many millions of people look up to. The black vote was 95% plus in favor of the Democrats. And so those are the three things that, in my view, explain why they won.
Dr. Dodds. Thank you, Dr.
So what determined the election? My colleague Michael Lipson is quite right. These models that political scientists put together, and they say, well, I've got this model, you just plug in the data and it'll explain the winner of every presidential election since World War II. And there's sort of a cottage industry in this. A lot of people do this. And 90% of the stuff you put in is economic data. It's, is it GDP per capita? Is it growth in GDP? Is it unemployment in the last 2 quarters, the last 6 months? Well, same thing. Anyway, so it's how you tweak that data. Politics is only at the edges of these models. So as a political scientist, you look at this and you think, well, shoot, what we're doing here is just at the edges, at the sides. It's epiphenomenal. All that really matters is economics. So let's just shut down the department and all become economists. It's really quite discouraging because politics has little say in determining these sort of things. Having said that, though, that last 10% is crucial. So in that last 10%, a lot of it is locked in. It's locked in terms of party identification, ideological orientation. That determines a lot of how people are going to vote ancestrally or even genetically. I mean, of that 10%, 80% is determined. So now we're down to 2%, and 2% is the difference between who won and lost 2 days ago. So how does that 2% go? Well, even part of that 2% is locked in because of demographics and geography. Utah, Texas, we're not going to vote Democratic even in a tsunami tidal wave, right? Hawaii and Massachusetts, we're not going to vote Republican ever. So it's people in those handful of states that everybody was talking about for the last year. The ground game does very much matter. It's not very sexy, it's not fun, it's not interesting, nobody wants to hear about it, but it determines a lot. I mean, the campaigns sink tons of money into data mining, sort of marketing data. Oh, let's identify people who drive sports sedans costing more than $40,000, who vacation in Disney World and golf. Republicans, potential Republicans. They may not know it, but we know it, and we're going to go after them and say, golf, vote Republican. And that stuff works, right?
I love golf, but I would never.
Well, sorry, I'm trafficking in stereotypes here, but and that's hugely important. But in terms of the politics of it and how it matters, one thing my colleagues have not yet touched on, and this I think is important, is sort of the framing of the election. And I'm sure you've heard this before, but is it a referendum on the incumbent president who's up for re-election, or is it an active choice between two alternatives? Romney likes the referendum conception. So you say, look, I'm a plausible alternative. I'm not going to give you a lot of details. All I can tell you is we can do better than this guy. I'm not so bad. Come on, what do you say? To sum up the Romney campaign message in a sarcastic sentence. Whereas Obama, he likes the choice conception. So he wants to say, no, this other guy is problematic, deeply problematic. And but it was only very late in the election, a couple weeks out, where Obama said, you know what, maybe I should put out a plan of my own and not just say it's 4 more years of the same. Here, well, you stay up all night and put this 28-page plan up on the website so I can say I actually have a plan. And that's what he did. I mean, hell, he should have had that a year ago. But that determines a lot. How do people view it? I mean, those few people are undecided. When they go to the polls, are they saying, look, does Romney, I keep saying that, combining the two. Does Obama get another shot? Did he deserve it? Has he already had his time? This guy Romney is a plausible alternative. That's a lot of it, I think.
Thank you very much. I don't see anybody lining up at the microphones. So, yeah, we do have to. Great. Please, madam.
Last year, I wrote a paper on the China rising power. So I just want to know, after this election, will this United States help the rise of China?
Thank you very much. Dr. Lipson, it's a foreign policy question, so let me ask you to address it first, and then the floor is open.
So this is one of the central issues in U.S. foreign policy for the last several years and going forward, is how to deal with the rise of China. It partly rests on some unknowns, such as China is undergoing a leadership change of its own now, and so what is the new Chinese leadership's approach and orientation towards the United States going to be? That will determine a lot. The Obama administration in the first term, and I think you can kind of expect a continuation of this, has approached China in much the same way that it has with a number of other countries, which is basically to say, we'd like to find areas of common ground where we can work together and act as partners. But on the other hand, if you behave in provocative ways or that challenge our interests, then we are going to defend our interests. And so when I think initially the Obama administration was looking for avenues for cooperation with China, but then when China began to behave in ways that other countries in the region perceived as heavy-handed or threatening, the Obama administration took some steps such as reaching an agreement with Australia to deploy a small number of U.S. Marines to a base in northern Australia, and some similar sorts of measures to reassure other countries in the region that the United States was going to defend their interests in case of Chinese provocation. And so I don't really have a crystal ball as to what's going to happen in U.S.-Chinese relations in the next 4 years, but I think that the foreign policy approach that the Obama administration adopts will continue to be this kind of on the one hand, on the other hand. We'd like to cooperate, we'll look for areas of cooperation, but we're also going to stand up for the interests of ourselves and our allies.
Dr. Chorny?
Yes, I think that it's very important, obviously. China and India are both rising powers in the global economy. And of course, in the United States, there are large numbers, and in Canada, large numbers of people who believe that too many manufacturing jobs have been offshored or shipped to China at great cost to our own people and to the people of the United States. And so therefore, and the labor unions, you know, they helped deliver the vote for Barak Obama in large numbers. They worked very hard in the ground game to help deliver the vote. So I would expect there'll be quite a lot of pressure on President Obama to address some of these issues. You know, these false, misleading ads that the Republicans presented were nonetheless about a real substantive question. And that is, can you have a proper economic recovery if you're shipping jobs based on the lowest common denominator wage without union rights to a developing superpower, which is what China is? So I expect this to become an interesting debate. In addition, the Chinese have shown themselves to be quite intelligent foreign investors, trying to pluck up resources, both in Canada and in the United States, in the oil industry, in the energy industry, for example. We also have the connection between Canada and the United States over the Keystone Pipeline, which Obama has vetoed, which the Chinese are quite happy to build help fund an alternative pipeline, which ecologically is opposed by many people, but through British Columbia to the Pacific. So these are going to be issues that are not going to go away. They're going to continue. And I expect them to be very important. The idea, which Obama stressed in the campaign, of domestic North American, it's interesting that he says that. Of course, he means us and Mexico. North American self-sufficiency in energy. This comes at the cost to the Chinese of denying them access to our energy. That's not what we're doing at the moment. So these are going to be issues. I'm sure there will be hot issues in the next 4 years.
Thank you very much. There was a question by the young gentleman.
So in terms of there's been a lot of mention of what the Obama administration should do, but what can it do with a divided Congress? I mean, is it more of the same, they're divided and then he can achieve nothing in the end?
Excellent question about divided government. Dr. Dodds, that's right down your alley.
I'll take a shot at it. I mean, it's a very apt question. The way I sort of frame the overall context is, you know, the U.S. has 3 branches in its federal government. In Canada, we forget this. It's much more divided institutionally in the United States. And courtesy of Obama's election, Democrats have a firm hold on that 1/3 that is the executive branch. Republicans have a firm hold on the judicial branch, which is a third equal, some people say co-equal if that makes it more equal, branch of government. They control the Supreme Court and equally importantly, maybe more importantly, the federal courts at the lower levels. So that leaves the third remaining branch of government, Congress, where Democrats, it seems, are going to have 54, 55 of the 100 Senate seats. You need 60 to do much. Republicans are going to have a slightly reduced but still big majority in the House. So you do the math. It's about as even, Steven, 50-50 a split as you can get. And the American system is designed to be very hard to get anything done, and it works very well in that regard. And with that 50-50 split, it will be very hard to get anything done. So I'm saying you've asked a great question. So what to be done? I mean, Obama's a great speechifier, if I may use that term, or rhetorician, as Dr. Chorny alluded to, but he's not so good at explaining policy. I mean, someone said after one of Bill Clinton's speeches at the Democratic Convention, President Obama, you should make Clinton in charge of explaining stuff. And I think he's absolutely right. He needs to better explain to people, look, Obamacare is great, and here's why. He's done a horrible job of that. So he could control the conversation. He can use his rhetoric and his power to speak eloquently to convince people of things. He could do a much better job of that. He can also act unilaterally. This is a research area of mine, but he can use executive orders, proclamations, memoranda to do an awful lot. There's a political price to be paid for that. You come to be seen as arrogant, egotistical. This is part of George Bush's problems. But you can do an awful lot unilaterally if you're willing to put up with the flack. And you can play tough. Obama is, I think, just systematically disinclined to engage in conflictual politics. I think we saw this in that first debate. But you know, that's how it works. You can't play nice with people who won't play nice with you. Politics is a dirty business. You got to put on brass knuckles and say the other guy is evil and wrong and here's why, and I'm going to go get him now. And that's not Obama, but I think it kind of has to be.
Dr. Lipson?
So it's a great question, and in part because the Republicans, as expected, held on to the House of Representatives, that puts real constraints on what how much Obama has the chance to implement a second-term agenda. So what this election was largely about was not whether grand plans are going to be implemented in the next 2 or 4 years, but about the things that were passed in the first term. Would they be implemented or would they be repealed by a Republican Congress and by a Republican president? So because Obama won, the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, is going to be implemented. The Republicans will not have the ability to block it, and I think that's huge. I think that's the sort of, for me personally, that was the key issue in the election. Also things like the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act will be implemented now, whereas they might not have been. They might have been repealed or watered down to the point of irrelevancy had Romney won the election. So much of the major accomplishments of the first 2 years of Obama's first term are now going to take effect over the next few years. And that's, I think, one of the major sort of takeaway implications of what happened on Tuesday. In addition, though, there are areas where, despite divided government, despite the Republicans holding on to the House, I think the Democrats and President Obama are in an advantageous position. One of them is that the nature of the deal that was reached on the increasing the debt ceiling and creating the fiscal cliff and the sequestration kind of situation that's looming now was that, so in exchange for the Republicans agreeing to raise the debt ceiling, the deal that was struck was basically that each side put on the table cuts that were viewed as likely to be unacceptable to them and their constituencies in order to force them to reach agreement on a kind of long-term debt reduction deal, which so far has failed. But if they don't reach one soon, then these major cuts, both to entitlement programs or whatever you want to call them, and also to defense spending, which were the things that the Republicans were supposed to care about, that they would be unwilling to see cut, and therefore that would force them to reach a deal. There'll be major defense cuts and major entitlement cuts. As well, though, the Bush tax cuts expire on December 31st unless new legislation is passed. And so the situation here is that unless the Republicans can come up with something acceptable to the Obama administration and the now increased Senate majority that the Democrats hold, in which some of the outgoing Democrats have been replaced by more liberal senators, so that the Senate is now more liberal than it were. It will be in January, more liberal than the current Senate. If the Republicans don't find something that's acceptable to the Republican House doesn't find something that's acceptable to a strengthened Democratic president and Senate majority, then the Bush tax cuts go away. And they have to face the defense cut portion of the sequestration agreement. And they're really not going to be happy about that. So that puts very strong pressure on the House Republicans to reach some kind of deal and show some kind of compromise that up until now they haven't been willing to do. I think their bet was when they reached the sort of sequestration deal that Obama would lose the election and that they would be in control in 2013. But now that Obama's been reelected and the Senate is actually going to be a bit more liberal, the Democrats really have a strong bargaining position over this issue. Many of the Republican members have taken a pledge that they would not vote to increase taxes, so that makes it hard to reach a deal before January 1st, 2013. But on January 1st, 2013, the Bush tax cuts expire, and so voting for a deal that would extend or revive the middle class portion of the Bush tax cuts, but not the tax cuts for the rich, would not count at that point as a tax increase. So it becomes easier, I think, for the Obama administration and the Senate Democrats to get their way. They have more bargaining leverage right now. That may require that they actually go over the fiscal cliff and then reach a deal in the day or week or so immediately after it. But I think that even given divided government, they've kind of set the structural conditions in a way that actually favor the Democrats on this issue. And then one of the things that President Obama has signaled as a major priority for the second term is immigration reform. And I think Republicans are now coming to realize that their inability to appeal to Hispanic voters is a major problem for their political future. So they may be much more amenable to reaching a deal with the Democrats on immigration reform than they were, say, a few weeks ago.
Dr. Carr.
Yeah, so trying to think of something new to throw into the equation. I think Michael really hit the nail on the head that the outcome of the election was about how much of the Obama administration, how many of the Obama administration first-term initiatives were just going to survive and be implemented. And I think it's an open question, to go back to something Graham said earlier about program and a vision. I think it's a really open question what bold new initiatives are out there for the Obama administration in the next 4 years. I dimly remember he was going to be the education president, and I dimly remember that there were going to be massive investments to support research and education in the United States. In the last 4 years, not entirely through the fault of the federal government because of the nature of constitutional control over educational policy, but the last 4 years have really seen a decimation of higher education in the United States and the collapse of many of the finest American universities, particularly state universities. We haven't seen the mass investments in a research and innovation agenda that was supposed to be there. So to me, it's an open question whether the next 4 years are whether the president is a managerial president for the 4 years or a president who really wants to take the United States in a bold new direction. But I guess I would also just add one other point. When I look at the world as it is today, it may be the case that foreign policy played very little role in the electoral campaign, but it's almost impossible to imagine that foreign policy will not become a major reality of administration in the next 4 years. Whether it's American policy vis-a-vis China, American policy vis-a-vis Iran, whether it's the situation in the Middle East, pick a country, with Syria, with Israel, whether it's the very uncertain and precarious nature of parts of Europe at the moment, all of those external realities are inevitably going to weigh heavily on American politics in the next few years, and so I think that's an imponderable, but it'll certainly be there in terms of shaping what the Obama administration chooses to do in the next 4 years. And of course, ironically, the one area where Obama, I think, clearly succeeded was in his nomination of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. You know, Hillary Clinton was the star point of delivery for the Obama administration year in and year out. And her departure, you know, changes things significantly in terms of that dossier going forward.
Thank you. Dr. Chorny, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think that Obama has actually a very interesting opportunity, which he sort of laid out in the speech, his victory speech, which is to continue the idea of a permanent election. Clinton was like this. You mobilize the population. So even if you face, obviously, as has been explained, tremendous structural problems in getting legislation through, you have one area that's really potentially very powerful, that's at your disposition, and that is mobilizing the public and public opinion in such a way as to put pressure on the Republicans who face, after all, in the House another election within 2 years. So if they are really obstructionist and try to prevent anything from going through, I think given the degree of mobilization of young people, of the minority groups, of the Obama constituency of women and so on, gays and other people like this, Obama has potentially quite a lot of cards he can draw upon, I think, in terms of politics, as opposed to legislation. And if the Republicans want to sort of play chicken, which they may well do, they will have to pay the consequences in the next electoral cycle. And so therefore, there is a little bit of room that's more optimistic, I think, for the Democrats than would appear from the fact that the House is still strongly under the control of the Republicans. So I think that you can't be sure. I agree also that foreign policy always plays a very big role in any administration. And usually in the second term, it plays an even bigger role. And there's some strange reason, I'm not sure what that is, but because I guess the president feels secure and is willing to dabble in areas that may not have originally been his, or we can say her eventually, area of specialization. And there's no shortage of foreign policy dilemmas, as has been explained by Graham. We've got, you know, the Middle East, we have Israel. And by the way, someone said, I just wanted to very briefly say, it's not Israel that was opposed to Obama, it was the Likud, which is a political party. Many people in Israel support Obama. They're not yet in the government because the government is a government of Likudniks. But now the government is in trouble because you know, they've blundered big time. So we'll see. That may shift as well. So anyway, I think that foreign policy will play a big role, and we have China, we have the Middle East, we have the mess in Europe, we have the ongoing fascinating developments in Latin America. There's no shortage of potential interesting areas there.
So ladies and gentlemen, we have 15 minutes left and 4 questions. So what I propose to do is this. I would ask each of you who has a question to please come to the microphone. So Munir, the young lady in the back, the young gentleman in the back, the gentleman on the right. Please ask your question in turn, and then we'll allow our panelists to answer whichever they pick.
Hello, my name is Sylvia. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. I know we're talking about the current elections, but I was wondering just about to analyze a little bit the Republican Party, because there's a lot of people criticizing that maybe they should move a bit more to the center, or maybe they're not conservative enough. So where do you think they go on from here for the future part of the Republican Party? And how would they start, since there's so much internal conflict maybe within the party?
Thank you very much. The question about the future and the internal politics of the Republican Party.
Hi, I'm Michel. During the elections, Romney's camp accused Barak's administration for being too weak in dealing with the problems in the Middle East. How do you think that Barak Obama will now deal with these problems since he was accused of being weak during the elections? Will he be more rough with the Middle East, or will he continue with his way of dealing before the elections? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So question about the implications for U.S.-Middle East relations and foreign policy towards that region. Munir.
Hi, Munir. Like you mentioned a lot about different ideas that Obama was reaching. Like basically, my question focuses on whether like this conservative religion within the Republican, like they're becoming more and more religious, they might become more like even outbidding in terms of gender, same-sex marriage, pro-life issues, that it might become problematic in U.S. politics, since the conservatives seems heading to that, or the Republicans are heading to that direction?
Thank you very much. And the last question?
Okay, well, while we're having our event, the Drudge Report, as you know, is just as famous as the Fox Network, the hateful people. They got it up to 4 now. Geithner and Hillary, you mentioned. Now it's Transportation Secretary and Napolitano. What's her name? Napolitano. Napolitano. She's replacing Eric Holder. I mean, that's already, on the books as far as he's concerned. Can you mention Eric Holder is an interesting situation? I hope you can comment on that replacement.
Thank you very much. So whichever question you would like to take, and whoever would like to take them. Dr. Dodds.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, of course, but I'll say I'll try to combine the, I guess, first and third question, Republicans, religion. So, I mean, more broadly, for Republicans, 2 days out, what do you make of this? I don't know. I mean, the party's going to have to do some real soul searching. They have lost a couple presidential elections after winning a whole bunch. And I think with the incredibly historic gains they made in the House in the last midterm elections, 2010, they were optimistic that Obama would be a one-term headache in the rear-view mirror at this point, but not so. I think that they need to come to terms somehow with this sort of demographic time bomb, this idea that the electorate is increasingly made up of what we in Canada would call visible minorities, and these are groups who have not much supported Republican candidates. They've got to find a way to appeal to them. As Michael Lipson suggested, this might augur well for a deal on immigration. Maybe it would neutralize the Democrats' advantage on that issue. Perhaps. You got to think Marco Rubio's stock is going through the roof right now, because I think people are going to see him as the silver bullet to solve this profound demographic time bomb, to mix my metaphors, sorry. He is the Cuban-American Republican Tea Party senator from Florida. The problem with the so-called fiscal cliff and whether Obama's got leverage is that every Republican member of the House has signed a pledge to Grover Norquist, this unelected guy who's more powerful than anybody, saying they will not raise taxes no matter what, never, never, never. It's a new Taylor Swift song or something like that. Anyway, and they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. All right, so what do you do then? You do like what Michael and others have suggested. You wait till the stroke of midnight, taxes expire. Okay, now we give everybody who's not a millionaire, or Obama says you can make $250,000 and still be middle class. I wish I were some middle class. A tax cut. That might be one way out of it. Although I don't know if Grover Norquist is going to say, okay, that counts as an infraction or not. And what he has to say about that's going to determine an awful lot. And then this issue of the so-called religious right. They were much more prominent in previous elections, it seems to me, than in this most recent one. In part, that's because Obama and Democrats have contested this vote, have not just conceded the evangelical vote, and it's huge. Something like 26% of the electorate identifies as evangelical. In Iowa, it's 40%, 4 out of 10. It's a lot of people. So I think they were less prominent in the politics of this last campaign, but they're still there. They do still largely support Republican candidates. I think they've been less visible, though, because I think on the host of social issues that have defined them and the culture wars, America has moved to the left and liberals have won in terms of abortion, in terms of same-sex marriage and gay rights. So I think they perceive that as a losing issue, which is why when Romney would start to talk about God and the Pledge of Allegiance and God and the lack of the Democratic platform, people said, no, it's just the economy, stupid. Stay on message, please. That's what we're going to win. That social stuff is a loser for us. And certainly 2 years ago, the Tea Party was much more fiscally conservative than socially conservative. So I think the religious right will continue to play a lesser and lesser role in Republican politics. But the big issue is, how do they appeal to people who don't live in the South, who are women and who are visible minorities. I mean, they have some appeal. We're not talking 100% black and white, but their appeal, again, is limited to a small and shrinking part of the rainbow that is the United States of America. So, I don't know.
Dr. Chorny?
Okay. Whether the Republican Party and whether the Tea Party, I think that they face an important dilemma, a choice. They have to redefine or define, as they've already defined, conservatism. What does it mean to be a modern conservative? This has been just like you have to ask the question, what does it mean to be a modern social democrat or a socialist or a liberal? These are questions that need to be asked every once in a while and need to be addressed. So I think there has to be some serious rethinking. The intelligentsia of American conservatism is not stupid. They're smart people, very smart people. But they're, I suppose, like other intelligentsia, is rather stubborn in trying to insist they can refashion the electorate to suit their purposes. The reality is the electorate, as we've discussed, seems to be increasingly based on what we call identity politics. Now, I'm a little skeptical of the wisdom of basing your politics on identity politics, because identities sometimes change, and loyalties change as people age and so on. And we have the very horrible experience in history of the identity politics fate of the Weimar Republic, which is very much par excellence identity politics in that era. So there are dangers in basing all of your politics on identity politics. I think you need to combine that with economic issues, bread and butter, so-called bread and butter issues that most people really care deeply about and that affect the way they're able to function in society. So I think these are, I don't have answers for them, but I think that they ought to conduct a serious dialogue amongst themselves and with other liberals and American centrists and even libertarians. Let them have an open, kind of cleansing discussion of where they would really like to go. And if they did that, it seems to me they would improve the kind of perspective they could present. There are lots of liberal people who have differences of opinion on some of the issues of identity politics and share quietly some of the concerns of the conservatives. I certainly share the conservative concern about human nature. I'm not exactly an optimist. I'm Jewish. And a third of my people were murdered in the 20th century. So why would I be, Pollyannish about human nature? I'm not, right? I'm deeply conservatively distrustful of some aspects of human nature. So I think the conservatives have a good case that they can explore. They should talk to some of the Rockefeller Republicans to the extent they may still exist. They should talk to Mitt Romney to talk about his father, who was much more of a centrist Republican, and so on. So I think they have an opportunity to refashion themselves. If they stay in the grip of the Tea Party, they're going to be a minority party, condemned never to win the presidency for a long time, right? And maybe eventually identity politics will disintegrate, but that's going to take quite a while. On the Middle East, well, the Middle East, we're talking essentially now about Iran, and we're talking about Israel, we're talking about Hezbollah, we're talking about Tunisia, we're talking about Libya, Egypt. It's a nightmare, right? It's sort of got great promise, but also great danger. And any American president who thinks they can easily, and I don't think any of them do actually, resolve the problems of the Middle East, they better think more carefully again. It's a huge, unsolvable problem for quite some time to come until there's a change of heart and will on the part of both, if we're talking about Israel and its surrounding neighbors and Palestinians, part of both parties in some ways. And in the question of Iran, well, I don't trust the Iranians, frankly. I mean, I've had Iranian students, they're wonderful people, but their regime is not a nice regime, right? It's a very tyrannical regime that's murdered lots of people. So why should we trust them? And I think Romney raised some important arguments there.
Dr. Carr.
Yeah, so just picking up on that last point, I think in a way that framing of the question around strength or weakness in terms of the Middle East and the Near East in the case of Iran, it's a reflection of a binary choice that sure doesn't work for that part of the world. the capacity for the United States or any other country to really exert power and influence in the Middle and Near East has diminished enormously, and it's far more complex. There are multiple players, as Harold's just laid out, and unfortunately, the relationship between the United States and the Middle and Near East is so susceptible to reductionism and so susceptible to simple choices. And in a way, I think, Romney's attempt to accuse Obama and the Obama administration of weakness, it didn't stick. People had lived through a strong, robust policy on the Middle East and Iraq with George Bush, and I'm not sure they were thrilled about how that played out. And to me, I'm certainly not a Middle Eastern expert by any stretch of the imagination, but what American policy needs is an appreciation of the complexity, the nuance, the malleability, and the unpredictability of the Middle and Near East as a region. And a strong foreign policy is going to be predicated in part on those qualities, which are not normal ways of defining strength.
Dr. Lipson.
Whether it's sanctions on Iran, whether it's the action in Libya, if there's going to be any kind of U.S. involvement in Syria, I think it would be along the lines of what happened in Libya. For Iran, discourage Israel from taking military action on its own, continue the effort with sanctions with European and other allies, and only as a last resort, if Iran appears to be on the verge of weaponization, then I think you would see U.S. airstrikes, but only in that event. And not any kind of ground commitment. I'm going to sort of combine the questions about the future of the Republican Party just very quickly. The way the American political system is designed in the Constitution, it creates different offices that are accountable to different sets of voters representing different constituencies. And so I think this creates a dilemma for the Republican Party in terms of where to go in the next few years. There's a pretty clear imperative, particularly at the national level, if they hope to win a presidential election in 4 years, that they have to find a way to appeal to a broader set of the American population, and they have to have something to say to Hispanics and African Americans and others who are making up an increasing portion of the electorate. But they're going to face resistance from what is now the base of the Republican Party, which is very conservative, whites, and increasingly elderly group mainly in the South. And so how do you reach out more broadly without alienating your current base? And so Romney was not able to navigate that successfully. It's not clear how the Republican Party is going to resolve that dilemma. But layered on top of that is, I think, a different set of interests for particularly House members in the Republican Party versus versus presidential aspirants. So to win the presidency, they're going to need to find a way to have a broader appeal. But the House, the districts are drawn in ways that make the incumbents very safe, and they often have districts that are very homogenous. So they're not going to feel this pressure. They're going to feel pressure to respond to their existing constituency. And the fact that the Republicans won the House in 2010 rather than 2012 or 2014 is disastrous for the Democrats, because redistricting in the United States, redrawing of districts, takes place on the basis of the census every 10 years. And so the Republicans were able to, and this also rested on their gains in state legislatures in the 2010 elections, which were significant. But they've been able to draw districts in ways that make their House majority pretty safe, even though Graham and I were just discussing right before the panel, the majority of Americans who voted in House elections this year actually voted for a Democrat. But the way that the votes are divided up into districts, incumbency plus the gerrymandering of districts makes the Republican majority pretty safe. And so the Republican House members are going to want to appeal to their existing base, which is going to make it harder for the national party to reach out more broadly.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 4 o'clock. So in closing, I would like to make 4 points. One, I would like to thank each and every one of you for showing up, engaging us in a very intellectually, very exciting conversation with our panelists about trying to understand the seemingly incomprehensible. What exactly happened in the United States just a couple of days ago and what it means for our collective future. Two, for those of you who registered for this event, let me remind you that your names will be entered into a draw, and the prize is a very important publication that was donated by Dr. Anton Bilodeau and Dr. Meb Skenji, professors at the Department of Political Science. It is a recent book that they co-edited about the history of Canadian elections. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for the eventual winner. Three, please don't forget about the Department of Political Science. We continue to provide lots of opportunities for engaging you, both the Concordia and the broader community, about important political and social issues. Tomorrow at noon, there will be a presentation by Dr. André Lacour from the University of Ottawa about the question of federalism in Nepal. If you have time to come back, we would be delighted to see you. And last, but certainly not least, on behalf of the Office of Alumni Relations and Advancement, as well as the Department of Political Science, I would like to thank each and every one of our panelists for taking time away from their extremely busy and important schedules to spend these last 2 hours with us. So Dr. Carr, Dr. Chorney, Dr. Dodds, Dr. Lipson, thank you. Please join me in a round of applause.